The fluorescent lights hummed above St. Michael's Hospital in Colorado Springs like insects trapped in glass, and Natalie Hayes moved through the pediatric ward at 6 in the morning with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing something 1,000 times before. 10 hours had bled into the previous shift. Her scrubs bore the evidence, a coffee stain the size of a quarter on her left sleeve, dried at the edges where it had set during the rush of admissions around 3 a.m. She didn't notice it. The body keeps moving when the mind is elsewhere, and hers was checking vitals, anticipating needs, reading the slight tremor in a child's breathing before the monitor caught it. Her hands were steady on the 4 lines she placed in room 207. Steady in the way hands become when they've held other people's lives together for long enough. There was a tremor sometimes, though, barely perceptible, visible only if someone was looking closely. It came when she signed discharge paperwork, when her fingers moved in American Sign Language to explain to a 7-year-old deaf patient that yes, the medicine would help, and yes, she could go home today. The girl's mother watched Natalie's hands move through space with a precision and grace she'd never seen in another nurse, and she leaned toward the charge nurse at shift change. "I want Natalie again next time. No one else. She understands him. Really understands." Before shift change, Natalie stopped at her locker. The metal door swung open to reveal neat rows of supplies, extra hair ties, a granola bar still wrapped from 2 weeks ago, a thermometer she'd forgotten to return. And in the corner, folded into a perfect triangle, a flag. 17 by 9 inches, the fabric worn soft from handling. The name tape along the edge read Corporal Morrison in faded black thread. She reached out and touched the corner of it once, the fabric warm from sitting against the metal, and then she closed the door. Every shift. Same ritual. Different reasons that she never spoke about. The morning briefing happened at 6:06 a.m. in the charting station on the 2nd floor. Natalie stood at the computer terminal entering notes on the 3 pediatric patients she'd managed through the night when the shift supervisor approached with new assignment sheets. Her gaze flicked up, practice gesture, acknowledging without losing focus. "You're moving to adult medicine today. 4th floor. We need you in 304. Room 304 was pneumonia and complications. Room 304 was a 72-year-old retired Marine with lungs that had never fully recovered from exposure to whatever had been burning at FOB Shank in Loga Province during the winter of 2008. Room 304 was Master Sergeant Chen, and Natalie knew his name before she read it on the chart because her son, deployed with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, had mentioned him exactly once over a choppy FaceTime call 6 months ago. "My CO is solid, Mom. No bullshit. Just competence and respect." Sergeant Chen made sure we understood the mission before we even boarded the bird. She didn't mention the recognition when she entered his room. Didn't mention the way she recognized the scar on his chest, a diagonal slash of pale tissue 3 inches below his collarbone, the kind of scar that comes from shrapnel that missed vital organs by millimeters. The kind of scar that meant someone else had died instead. He was pale beneath his tan, and the pneumonia had settled into his chest cavity like an unwelcome houseguest. His breathing was labored, 8 respirations a minute too fast, and his oxygen saturation was running at 93%, which was acceptable but not safe. Not for long. The morning ward rounds began at 7:15. Dr. James Pierce moved through the hospital like a man accustomed to the space parting before him, which it did. He was new to St. Michael's, recently appointed chief of surgery, and his credentials were exactly as impressive as he believed them to be. Harvard Medical School. Chief resident at Johns Hopkins. Published research on trauma protocols that had been cited exactly 417 times. He wore it like cologne, heavy and impossible to ignore. He arrived at the 4th floor nursing station at 7:43 a.m., which was early for rounds. The day shift was still settling in. Natalie was at the medication dispensary, extracting for antibiotic compounds for her newly assigned patients, when Pierce rounded the corner toward the vending machine. His entourage, 3 residents and a medical student, orbited him in careful formation, notepads ready, anticipation on their faces like athletes before a game. The vending machine clicked and hummed. Natalie's hand reached for the button at precisely the same moment Pierce's did. He took the coffee that dropped, black, no sugar, which was evident from the years of coffee stains on his white coat, and then he turned to face her. His eyes moved down from her face to the stain on her scrub sleeve, lingering on it with the particular intensity of a surgeon who notices imperfection the way other people notice light. "Nursing school," he said, his voice carried to the residents behind him like he was delivering a lecture, presumably teaches fundamental hygiene standards. The concept of changing scrubs between 12-hour rotations. He smiled without warmth. Apparently not at every program. The room went quiet. The vending machine finished its mechanical exhalation. One of the residents looked at her shoes. Another stared at his phone. The medical student's face colored to the shade of the fire exit sign on the opposite wall. Natalie finished her medication drawer. She looked at Pierce once, her eyes gray the color of a weapon at rest, and then she moved past him toward the med cart without comment. Her composure was a thing with its own weight, not defensive, not broken, just absent. Like she'd heard words in a language she didn't recognize. She had, though. She recognized it perfectly. She'd heard exactly this tone before, in exactly this configuration, from exactly this type of person. Men who possessed titles and believed that titles were the same thing as competence. Men who mistook cruelty for leadership. The coffee stain remained on her scrub for the rest of the shift. By 8:15 a.m., Dr. Pierce had reviewed the night shift reports. Natalie's charts appeared in a stack, notes on the pediatric patients with her initials at the bottom. The handwriting was precise, the medical information comprehensive, the clinical assessments accurate. He flipped through 3 of them and felt irritation rise in his chest like acid reflux. There was nothing wrong with them. Nothing at all. Which was, inexplicably, more irritating than if they'd been deficient. He pulled up the hospital personnel database from his office. Natalie Hayes. RN, BSN, hired 7 years ago. No advanced certifications listed. No publications. No speaking engagements at nursing conferences. No evidence of the kind of ambition that made people climb hierarchies. She simply existed in the system, moving patients through their recovery, asking nothing, expecting nothing. The employment history showed a gap from 2015 to 2019. For years missing from the record. He zoomed in on the HR notes. The section was blank. Completely blank. He closed the file and sat back in his chair. In his experience, blank sections in personnel files came from exactly 2 sources: administrative error or deliberate omission. He was going to find out which one it was. And whatever he found, he was going to ensure that when he was finished, everyone at St. Michael's understood a fundamental truth: nurses did not outshine surgeons. Not in his hospital. Not on his watch. At 9:13 a.m., Natalie entered Master Sergeant Chen's room with a fresh bag and an antibiotic compound that needed to run over 30 minutes. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, and his left hand was moving in small repetitive motions against the blanket, a gesture she recognized as discomfort. She moved to his bedside, set the medication down, and when his eyes opened, she began to sign. Her hands moved through the space between them with a fluency that seemed to make the air itself lighter. "Good morning, Sergeant. How is your pain?" Each word in ASL was a complete thought expressed through hand shape, position, movement, orientation. She signed it the way a musician plays music, not translating from English, but thinking in her native language, the language that had saved lives in the Hindu Kush when screaming wouldn't, when English failed under fire, when only her hands and the look in her eyes could tell a wounded Marine that someone competent was there, that he wasn't dying alone. Chen's eyes widened. His hands moved in response, slower than hers, 40 years of noise damage and age working against his fluency, but the sign was clear: Valkyrie. The room went still. Natalie's hands continued to sign, steady as surgical instruments. "Pain management. Talk to me." Chen's jaw tightened. He signed again, careful, deliberate: "You saved my unit." "Afghan. Snow. Incoming." She signed only, "Medication first. Then we talk." Her voice, when she spoke aloud to document his medication administration, carried a note that hadn't been present before. Authority. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and recognized it when it returned. Pain level from 1 to 10, Sergeant. 6, he signed, and then in a whisper, his voice rough from disuse with spoken English, why are you? Medication, she said, and there was nothing unkind in it, only the kind of directness that comes from military training. Answers later. Your body first. The 4-line ran clear. The antibiotic began its work. And in room 304, where a man who had carried her memory for 15 years finally understood that some people don't actually disappear, that some of them just learn to be invisible instead, Natalie Hayes began the slow and careful work of healing someone who had already survived the impossible. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce had watched the entire interaction from the doorway, unseen, unnoticed, his eyes narrowing at the sudden transformation in a nurse he'd already decided was mediocre, at the way she moved with an authority that shouldn't exist in someone without a title, at the way a 72-year-old Marine had wept when she touched his shoulder. He stood in the hallway for exactly 4 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone and opened a blank incident report form. The conference room at St. Michael's smelled like burnt coffee and institutional fear. 18 residents sat in perfect rows, their laptops open, their expressions arranged into the careful blankness of people learning to survive hierarchy. The projection screen glowed with Natalie's handwriting, her chart notes from the previous week, enlarged until her careful documentation became indictment. Dr. Pierce stood beside the screen like a prosecutor presenting evidence of incompetence, and the fluorescent panel above his head caught the edge of his smile. Let's examine what happens when nursing staff exceed their training, he announced, his voice carrying the theatrical precision of someone performing for an audience. He adjusted his reading glasses. Nurse Hayes submitted these notes following her interaction with the cardiac patient in room 201. I quote, "Patient reports increased comfort and decreased anxiety. Vital signs stabilized. Patient requested additional time with this nurse for future shifts." He paused, letting silence gather like fog. Subjective nonsense without quantifiable metrics. What we have here is emotional labor masquerading as medical care. One of the residents, a thin intern with the posture of someone still learning not to flinch, raised his hand slightly. "But sir, her pain scores dropped by 4 points. That's measurable." Pierce's head turned with the slow precision of a surveillance camera. "I'm teaching you real medicine, not feelings, doctor. Numbers without context are just noise." He turned back to the screen and continued reading, his tone shifting into something that sounded almost bored, which somehow made it worse. The patient became emotional during the communication exchange. He looked up. "This is what we call boundary violation. Professional distance. It's called professional distance for a reason." Natalie stood at the back of the conference room, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone the color of old bone. She had watched other people be dismantled before. She had watched it happen in medical tents where the electricity ran on generators and the blood never quite dried from under the fingernails, where senior officers used junior medics as examples in exactly this same way, loud enough for everyone to hear, precise enough that you couldn't argue with it, designed so that everyone in the room understood the hierarchy and their place in it. She took one measured breath. Let it out. Took another. The trembling was internal. Always internal. Her hand stayed steady. Her jaw stayed relaxed. She had learned this in places Pierce had only read about in military history journals. The residents would not look at her. That was the worst part, not the words, but the practiced avoidance of human contact, the way they suddenly became fascinated with their laptop screens, with the coffee cups in front of them, with anything except her face. One young woman, a third-year resident who had once asked Natalie for advice on managing a difficult pediatric case, stared so intently at her keyboard that her eyes began to water. Pierce concluded with the precision of someone who had planned every syllable. This is the standard we maintain at St. Michael's, people. Competence. Distance. Professionalism. He turned to Natalie one final time. You can go back to your floor now, Nurse Hayes. Thank you for the demonstration. She left the room without changing her expression. The door closed behind her with a hydraulic whisper that sounded like mercy. By Friday afternoon, the first incident report appeared in her personnel file. Then the second. Then the third. Pierce had begun his documentation the moment Chen had signed his name during Natalie's initial assessment, the moment her hands had moved through ASL with the fluency of someone who had spent years speaking in silence. The reports were masterpieces of bureaucratic weaponization, each one citing her communication methods as unauthorized, her familiarity with the patient as a boundary violation, her knowledge of military protocols as an inappropriate overstep. The most damning note read, patient specifically requested ASL fluent nursing care. Request was accommodated. However, Nurse Hayes' interaction with said patient suggests possible personal connection beyond professional scope of practice. The irony was surgical. Chen had asked for her. She had answered. And that act of compliance had become the evidence of her transgression. Natalie found herself standing at the vending machine on Friday at 1,400 hours, her scrub stained with juice box residue from a pediatric patient named Marcus who had thrown the container in what his mother called a normal tantrum but what Natalie recognized as the quiet desperation of a 5-year-old who had learned that control over anything, even the direction of fruit punch, was a form of power he could still claim. The stain spread across her left thigh like a watercolor. She was reaching for a coffee when Pierce arrived with 6 of his residents, his white coat pristine as surgical gauze, his Rolex catching light like a trophy. I wonder if nursing school teaches basic hygiene anymore, he said, his voice pitched to carry across the break room, or if that's considered too advanced. He paused, let his gaze rest on her stain, wrinkled his nose as though he had encountered something that had begun its decay. Some people just don't have standards. The resident stared at their shoes. One of them, the brave one from Grand Rounds, shifted his weight uncomfortably but said nothing. The vending machine hummed its mechanical drone. Natalie met Pierce's eyes. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and in that moment something shifted in her expression, not anger, not fear, but something deeper, a kind of clarity that made the air between them feel thin. A single tear escaped her left eye. She didn't wince. Didn't apologize. Didn't look away. She wiped it with the back of her hand while maintaining complete eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only Pierce heard it clearly, though the residents would repeat her words to others, would be repeating them still in 6 months. I've been dismissed by better men than you, Doctor. She turned and walked away. Her pace was measured. Her posture remained upright. Her hands didn't shake until she was alone in the supply closet 3 minutes later, standing in the dark between shelves of gauze and saline, where she let her shoulders drop for exactly 90 seconds before straightening again and returning to the floor. Pierce's campaign accelerated. He began moving through the hospital like a man conducting an investigation, his phone constantly present, his notebook filling with observations. He photographed Natalie adjusting Chen's oxygen line. He documented her signing with the patient during vitals checks. He filed observation reports citing her unusual familiarity with military terminology and her inappropriate emotional investment in patient outcomes. His power source was institutional. He was chief of surgery now, which meant administrators returned his calls, which meant his documentation was never questioned, only filed and catalogued and added to the growing stack of evidence that would eventually be presented to human resources as a case of professional incompetence and boundary violation that had somehow escaped notice until now. By Sunday evening, the ethics board had issued a formal letter requiring Natalie to submit to cultural competency review. The letter arrived as an email marked urgent. She read it alone, sitting on the back stairwell of the hospital during her break, the concrete cold beneath her body, her phone screen casting her face in white light. The letter demanded she justify every interaction with Master Sergeant Chen. Provide documentation of her ASL certification. Explain her unusual familiarity with military protocols and medical procedures. Demonstrate that her relationship with the patient remained within professional boundaries. The deadline was Monday morning. She could not comply. Any official documentation of her military background would trigger the Pentagon watch list she had been running from for 4 years, the alert system designed to flag any reference to Captain Natalie Hayes in any official capacity, to prevent the accidental disclosure of classified operations from 2019, the ones that had ended with a recommendation that she disappear from all public records, that her service record be sealed, that she become officially invisible. She sat in her car in the hospital parking garage for 40 minutes before driving home. Her hands gripped the steering wheel like she was bracing for impact. Rain had begun to fall, the kind of Colorado evening rain that came without warning and departed just as quickly, hammering the roof of her Subaru like applause she hadn't earned. Her phone buzzed. A text from her 12-year-old daughter, "Mom, where are you?" "It's 5:30. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because when she walked through the front door, she would have to look at her daughter's face and explain why Mommy was coming home early, why her eyes were red, why the woman who had spent 12 years holding broken soldiers together in field tents had somehow been broken by one man with a notebook and a title. The silence in the car was so complete that the sound of her own breathing became the loudest thing in the world. And in the hallway outside Chen's room, Dr. Pierce stood with his phone camera raised. The flash reflected off the glass partition as Natalie's silhouette moved through the room, adjusted the oxygen line, signed something to her patient that would have been impossible for anyone without her training to understand. The photograph would become exhibit number 5 in the file that was growing like a tumor, and Pierce would file it Monday morning with a note, "Patient interaction photographed at 18:47 hours, Sunday evening. Communication exchange in progress. Documented for clinical review purposes." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Monday morning would bring a confrontation that Pierce had been orchestrating since the moment he learned that Natalie's fingertips moved through space with the precision of someone who had spoken with her hands for far longer than she had spoken with her voice, and that knowledge, the knowledge of her hidden fluency, would become the final piece of evidence he needed to begin the end. Tuesday morning arrived at 0830 hours the way all hospital mornings arrive, fluorescent lights already humming their electric complaint, the ventilation system churning stale recirculated air, and Master Sergeant Chen pressing the call button with trembling fingers because something inside his chest had shifted wrong during the night and he couldn't quite breathe without pain anymore. Natalie was 3 doors down in room 307, checking post-operative vitals on a 7-year-old with appendicitis, when the cardiac monitor began its escalating beep. Not the steady rhythm of normal operation. The accelerating chirp that meant something catastrophic was unfolding in room 304. She didn't pause. Didn't announce herself. She simply moved, abandoning the blood pressure cuff mid-squeeze and crossing the hallway with the kind of efficient silence that combat medics develop after enough field operations, the knowledge that every second wasted is a life calculation. The day shift nurse, Rebecca Chen, no relation to the Master Sergeant, stood frozen beside the patient's bed, her hands hovering uselessly as Master Sergeant Chen's body convulsed in a coughing fit so violent it seemed to be tearing through him from the inside out. His lips had gone the color of storm clouds. His fingers were clawing at the oxygen mask, at his own chest, at the fractured space between breathing and drowning. Natalie took in the room with a combat medic's assessment, unilateral chest rise on the left side. Tracheal deviation. Muffled breath sounds on the affected side. The decades-old shrapnel wound from his time in the Hindu Kush was doing exactly what old combat injuries do when the body loses structural integrity, it was collapsing. The pneumothorax had become a tension pneumothorax, the kind that kills you in minutes if nobody stops the pressure buildup that's crushing his lung toward his heart. Oxygen saturation? Natalie's voice was a command. 94, Rebecca whispered. Then 88. 82. The numbers were falling like an elevator with cut cables. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle and betadine. Now. And call Dr. Pierce's office. Natalie was already pulling the vital monitor closer, reading the rhythm with the clinical precision of someone who had stood over far too many chests in tents with canvas walls and mortar rounds walking closer. The rhythm was tachycardic, compensating, screaming through the electrocardiogram like an animal in a trap. Rebecca turned toward the supply closet, moving with glacial hesitation. She was competent. She was trained. She was also 17 years removed from having to make split-second decisions on whether a patient lived or died in the next 90 seconds. "He needs a doctor," Rebecca said, not moving fast enough. "We should wait for." "He'll be dead before the doctor arrives," Natalie said. The statement carried no anger, no judgment. Just mathematics. 76 now. Falling. "I need the needle." She didn't wait. She was already pulling the equipment cart closer, already locating the alcohol swab, already palpating the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark that was drilled into every combat medic's muscle memory through repetition and necessity, and the knowledge that you might have to do this in the dark, under fire, with your hand shaking and your brain screaming, and the only thing between this moment and a body bag being the training your body refused to forget. The betadine went on. Her fingers mapped the landscape of ribs and cartilage like someone reading an ancient text in Braille. The needle was in her hand before she consciously reached for it. The second intercostal space. The midclavicular line. The needle angled slight upward, passing above the rib, avoiding vessels. 20 years of field hospitals in Kandahar had taught her that hesitation was a luxury. Movement was salvation. Her hands had held this precision once before, had moved through this exact procedure while incoming fire cracked overhead and plasma from 4 bags hung from rifle muzzles, and someone was screaming for their mother in Dari. The hiss. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. The sound of pressure releasing, of air escaping, of a lung remembering it could expand. Chen gasped. His body jerked like someone had driven an electrical current through him. His eyes flew open. The monitor changed its song. The oxygen saturation climbed. 88. 92. 94. The rhythm began to stabilize, the wall of tachycardia receding like a tide going back out to sea. That was when the door opened. Dr. Pierce stood in the threshold, his white coat still pristine at 08 for 7 in the morning, his posture rigid with the particular fury of a man watching his authority be bypassed. His eyes moved from Natalie to the needle to the patient gasping back to consciousness like someone remembering how to live. The calculations began behind his eyes. She could see them happening. The assessment of the situation. The recognition that she'd just performed a physician-level procedure without a physician's credentials. The understanding that this moment could become his evidence, his justification, his final argument. She pulled the needle back slightly, confirmed placement, and taped it with practiced efficiency. "Get me a dressing for this site and notify respiratory," Natalie said to Rebecca, whose face had gone pale. "He needs a chest x-ray to confirm full lung re-expansion. And he's going to need pain management soon." "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Pierce's voice was quiet. That made it worse. The quiet voice of someone for whom volume was no longer necessary. He'd moved past anger. He was in a space beyond that, the clinical, surgical precision of a man constructing a case. Natalie met his eyes. She didn't look away. "He had 90 seconds before cardiac arrest," she said. The needle decompression was emergent. The alternative was watching him die. Pierce's hands had already moved to his phone. She watched him photograph the needle site. The setup. The 4-pole. Her hands, still trembling with the adrenaline that combat medic training could regulate but not eliminate. He was constructing a narrative with every image, unauthorized procedure, breach of protocol, dangerous overreach by someone operating outside her scope of practice. "I need security in room 304, Pierce said, speaking into his phone with the calm of someone executing a long-planned operation. "I have a nurse practicing medicine without a license." "Yes. Now." Master Sergeant Chen, conscious enough now to understand what was happening, made a small desperate sign toward Natalie with his right hand, the beginning of a word she didn't have time to receive. A Marine charge nurse appeared in the doorway, summoned by the commotion, and gently placed a hand on Natalie's arm. "Come on," the charge nurse whispered. "Don't make this worse." Natalie allowed herself to be guided into the hallway. She could feel Pierce behind her, still photographing, still documenting, still building his case like a man assembling the components of a bomb. The hallway stretched too long. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a pallid institutional glare. Her heart rate was finally beginning to slow, the adrenaline beginning to metabolize, and in that clearing space she understood with absolute clarity what she'd just done. She'd saved a life. And in doing so, she'd handed Dr. Pierce exactly the evidence he needed to end hers. Within the hour, Pierce sat across from the hospital administrator in an office on the 3rd floor, his 9 previous incident reports spread across the desk like a prosecutor presenting a final argument. 9 forms. For patient boundary concern complaints. 2 photographic records of unauthorized medical procedures. Each one meticulously completed. Each one grammatically perfect. Each one constructed with the bureaucratic precision of someone who understood that institutions moved on paperwork, not on truth. This is a pattern, Pierce said, his voice calm and clinical. An escalating pattern of dangerous overreach. She performs procedures without authorization. She communicates with patients in ways that blur professional boundaries. Today she performed emergency needle decompression, a physician-level procedure, without so much as notifying me first. She's not qualified. She's a liability waiting for a malpractice suit. The administrator, Karen Martinez, read through the forms with the careful attention of someone who understood that hospitals operated on insurance premiums and lawsuit avoidance. Each allegation was just vague enough to be unprovable. Each one was just specific enough to create reasonable doubt about Natalie's judgment. I need this handled, Pierce said. She needs to be removed from the surgical unit immediately. The emergency procedure alone is grounds for termination. Martinez looked up from the paperwork. She was competent, fair-minded, and trapped, like they all were, inside the machinery of institutional risk management. I'll need to speak with her, Martinez said carefully. And with the patient. If Master Sergeant Chen is saying that she saved his life, he'll say whatever he wants, Pierce interrupted smoothly. But the procedure was unauthorized. That's the issue. That's not about patient gratitude. That's about scope of practice. That's about her breaking hospital protocol because she thought she knew better than the attending physician. The words landed like stones in water, each one rippling outward through the machinery of the institution. Natalie was 5 floors below, standing at the medication cart, pretending to count controlled substances while her hands methodically arranged and rearranged the same plastic cups that had been arranged 1,000 times before. She had 12 days of paid leave saved up. She had a daughter who came home from school at 1,430 hours. She had a secret that was no longer secret, a cover that had just been blown wide open in front of at least 4 witnesses, and a career that was probably ending in an HR office by Thursday. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she hadn't hesitated. The worst part was that when given the choice between protocol and a life, her body had moved like a weapon aimed at salvation, and in doing so, she'd revealed exactly who she really was to a man who understood how to weaponize the truth. Thursday arrived like a verdict. 1:40 in the afternoon, and Natalie sat across from HR Director Karen Martinez in a conference room that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and the particular fear that comes from knowing exactly what's about to happen. Hospital counsel sat to Martinez's left. Dr. Pierce occupied the chair at the head of the table like a general surveying conquered territory, a manila folder open before him with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. We've conducted a thorough review, Martinez began, her voice the careful neutral of someone protecting the institution first and people second. Pierce didn't wait for her to finish. He slid the first document across the polished table, a 9-page compilation of incident reports, each one stamped with dates and times like evidence at trial. Incident 1, Pierce said, his voice smooth as a scalpel. Unauthorized communication methods with a patient. ASL fluency in a non-certified capacity. The paper landed in front of Natalie. She didn't touch it. Incident 2. Excessive time allocation in patient room 304. 43 minutes on a single shift devoted to one patient. Another document. Then another. For more incident reports followed, each one a small knife wrapped in bureaucratic language. Patient boundary concerns. Unorthodox procedural approaches. Communications that suggested a personal rather than professional relationship with the patient. We also have photographic documentation, Pierce continued, producing two 8x10 photographs printed on glossy stock. The first showed Natalie's hands, her small, capable hands with the faint white scars across the knuckles that nobody asked about, performing needle decompression on Master Sergeant Chen's chest. The second image caught her face mid-procedure, eyes locked on the monitor, absolute concentration, absolute competence. An authorized medical procedure, Pierce said, as if competence and protocol were the same thing. Performed without physician oversight. Without documented physician order. The chain of command was entirely circumvented. The photographs slid across the table like crime scene evidence. The room had that dead air quality of spaces where decisions had already been made. Natalie could hear the fluorescent panels humming overhead, the distant sound of a monitor beeping 3 floors down, the rain that had started without warning against the window glass. Her hands remained flat on the table. Her breathing stayed level. She'd survived worse briefings than this, classified debriefings where the wrong reaction could cost intelligence assets their lives. Your response, Nurse Hayes? Martinez asked, her tone suggesting there was no response that would matter. Natalie opened her mouth. Closed it. The truth sat behind her teeth like a loaded weapon she couldn't fire. She couldn't say that needle decompression on a tension pneumothorax had become muscle memory through 2,400 field procedures across forward operating bases in Helmand Province, Loga Province, and Cunha Province. Couldn't explain that in 2019, Captain Natalie Hayes had orchestrated the extraction of 16 intelligence assets from a black site compound, that the operation had gone sideways in ways that required Pentagon-level cleanup, that her entire official military record had been erased by federal order and buried so deep that even mentioning it would trigger a national security investigation that could expose operators still working those networks. She was supposed to be invisible. Invisible nurses didn't fight back. Invisible nurses didn't have Navy crosses in locked boxes at home or tattoos of fallen teammates' names where hospitals never looked. Invisible nurses certainly didn't save lives in ways that required explaining a clearance level that officially didn't exist. I saved his life, she said quietly. Pierce leaned forward, his smile the kind that comes from absolute certainty of victory. You violated protocol. There's a difference. At 14:47, the termination letter slid across the desk. Not handed. Slid. Like it was something toxic they didn't want to touch. Effective immediately. Security escort to collect personal items. Final paycheck processed within 10 business days. Her badge, which had taken 3 years of background checks to obtain, was already being deactivated. We'll need your hospital credentials, Martinez said, not meeting her eyes. The walk to her locker happened under fluorescent lights with 2 security guards flanking her like pallbearers. Other nurses watched from doorways. Some had tears in their eyes. None of them moved to intervene. They had mortgages and families and the understanding that institutions always protected themselves first. Natalie moved with the same measured pace she'd used walking through hostile territory, each step deliberate and controlled. She opened her locker. Pulled out the folded flag, faded OCP camouflage, folded into that perfect triangle by hands that had been shaking when they did it, the flag that had draped a casket for Corporal Jackson Morrison, the 22-year-old who'd bled out on her chest 3 miles from Phi Bay Scorpion because he trusted her to get him home, and she almost had, but not quite. She touched Morrison's name tape sewn into the corner. Didn't let anyone see her do it. The drive home took 27 minutes through Colorado Springs traffic. She arrived at 15:45 to find her 12-year-old daughter Emma at the kitchen table, homework spread out in front of her like a normal Thursday afternoon, like the world hadn't just collapsed into something unrecognizable. Emma looked up when the door opened. Confusion flickered across her face first. Then understanding. Then fear. Mommy, why are you home? The question was small. Frightened. Innocent in the way that only children could be innocent, containing no malice, just confusion at the violation of the natural order. Mothers were at work on Thursday afternoons, not at kitchen tables at 2 p.m. on a day when everything was supposed to be normal. Natalie's composure shattered. She made it 3 steps before the first sob took her. Not the controlled breathing of a trained operative. Not the measured response of someone who'd held dying soldiers and kept working. Her body folded in on itself, and she pulled Emma close, and the 12-year-old felt the trembling that the hospital never saw, the fear that the military had trained her to bury so deep it might never surface, the particular terror of a woman who'd survived 2 deployments and classified operations and being erased from official records, only to be destroyed by a man with a folder and the institutional power to make invisible people disappear. Emma's small arms wrapped around her mother's neck. "Mommy? Are we going to be okay?" Natalie lied. "Yes, baby. We're going to be okay." But that night, after Emma fell asleep, Natalie sat alone in the darkness with Morrison's folded flag on the kitchen table, watching how the overhead light caught on the embroidered name tape, wondering if disappearing was supposed to feel this much like dying. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The video landed 48 hours after the termination letter dried on Pierce's desk. A 30-second clip, posted by Dr. Sarah Reeves, the same resident who'd questioned him during grand rounds, the one whose courage he'd mistaken for insubordination. The footage was crystalline. Pierce at the vending machine, coffee machine humming behind him like a mechanical heartbeat, his voice cutting through the hospital's fluorescent silence. "I wonder if nursing school teaches basic hygiene anymore." His eyes flicking deliberately toward Natalie's scrub pocket, the coffee stain visible even in compressed video quality. The timestamp read Tuesday, 1447 hours. Exactly 1 week before. By Thursday evening, the video had 340,000 views. By Friday morning, 890,000. The algorithms had recognized something primal in the footage, a predator caught on film, unaware of the witness. Dr. Bullying trended in Colorado by noon. Military hero by afternoon. Local news picked it up at 1800 Friday, a 2-minute segment, hospital staff member faces termination after viral bullying video. They didn't know who Natalie was yet. Not officially. But the comments knew. Residents who'd watched her with patience. Nurses who'd seen her stabilize the unstable. The internet had already written the story before the Pentagon could stop it. Pierce's phone erupted. Colleagues texting carefully worded distance. Speaking engagements cancelled via email. His wife, Catherine, asking in the kitchen at midnight, "Is that really you?" Not angry. Worse, disappointed. The kind of tone that meant 30 years of credibility could evaporate in 30 seconds of cruelty. He sat in his home office, diploma from Johns Hopkins on the wall, photograph of him shaking hands with a hospital CEO, watching the view counter climb with the numb fascination of a man watching his own execution in slow motion. 1.2 million views. 1.4 million. The comments were a funeral pyre. But the killing blow came Saturday morning. Dr. Robert Kensington, Pierce's medical school mentor and thesis advisor, a Marine Corps veteran who'd served in Desert Storm, saw the video Friday night at 21:30. Called Pierce directly. "Is this you, Michael?" The voice was ice. Pierce tried to explain about insubordination, about policy violations, about documentation. Kensington cut him off. "She's a decorated Marine who saved 17 lives. You mocked her for a coffee stain." Pierce stammered about procedures. Kensington's response was a single sentence, "I taught you medicine." "I thought I taught you honor." "I was wrong about the second part." The line went dead. Saturday morning, Kensington published a letter in the Journal of American Surgery. 700 words requesting his name be removed from their 3 co-authored papers. Calling Pierce's behavior antithetical to the values of military medicine and basic human decency. He copied the hospital board, the state medical board, and the dean of Johns Hopkins Medical School. The letter went viral before breakfast. Physicians began publicly disassociating themselves from Pierce's work. A surgical society requested his resignation from their ethics committee by noon. His license, not revoked yet, but suspended pending investigation by Monday morning. The state medical board launched a formal inquiry into his fitness to practice. The hospital board placed him on immediate suspension pending review. His office was cleaned out by Tuesday. Box by box. His diploma, his awards, his photograph with the CEO, all packed by an administrative assistant who didn't make eye contact. Pierce sat at home Wednesday afternoon, watching the news articles cycle through local outlets, each one adding more context. Veteran nurse defended by military community. Marine Corps hero fired for exposing hospital bullying. Master Sergeant Chen was interviewed, his son translating his ASL through tears. Captain Hayes saved my life twice. Dr. Pierce tried to punish her for it. That tells you everything about character. Chen's signature was distinctive. Hands moving with precision, each gesture carrying weight. The video had 2.3 million views by Thursday morning. The formal termination letter arrived in Pierce's email at 1700 Thursday. Exactly 2 weeks after Natalie had received hers. The irony arrived with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. 6 months dissolved into November. St. Michael's Hospital reorganized under new leadership, a woman named Director Sandra Whitmore, a former Army nurse who'd spent 20 years in field medicine before entering administration. She cleaned house methodically. New protocols. New value statements. A mandatory course on workplace respect, which Pierce's name appeared in the curriculum under case study, What Not to Do. Natalie walked through those same corridors on her first day as Chief of Emergency Medicine, and the hallway seemed to rearrange itself around her presence. Not submissively. Respectfully. The kind of respect earned through survival, not granted through title. Her office had been Pierce's. She kept one decoration, the coffee-stained scrub pocket, framed and mounted on the wall with a placard reading for basic hygiene. A resident had given it to her as a joke gift. She kept it as a monument. The staff meeting at 0700 was crowded. 15 residents, 12 nurses, for attending physicians. Natalie stood at the whiteboard, trauma triage protocols written in blue marker, her voice steady and command-like, nothing deferential anymore. New protocol for pneumothorax assessment. Portable ultrasound before needle decompression when possible. But if possible becomes impossible, you decompress. Documentation after stabilization. Always. A resident raised his hand. What if administration questions the procedure? Natalie's slight smile, then administration doesn't understand emergency medicine. The room understood. The timid nurse from Grand Rounds was gone. A captain had returned. Pierce appeared in brief, devastating cuts. Colorado Springs Community College, Building C, Classroom 312. Demonstrating chest compressions on a CPR mannequin to 7 board students, his voice flat and instructional. 30 compressions. 2 rescue breaths. Repeat. No engagement. No presence. His medical license restricted to teaching only, CPR certification courses, $18 an hour, strip mall classroom smelling of coffee and stale air. During his break, he scrolled his phone and saw the news notification, Decorated Marine takes leadership at St. Michael's Hospital. He read the byline. Natalie's photograph in dress blues, the Navy cross visible on her chest. He deleted the notification. Didn't change anything. Master Sergeant Chen volunteered 3 days a week in the hospital's new Veteran Services Program, 2nd floor, office with a view of the parking lot. On his desk sat a single photograph. Younger Natalie in dress blues. Standing beside Morrison's folded flag at Arlington National Cemetery, the headstones stretching endlessly behind them like an ocean of marble and names. Morrison. The name tape embroidered in white thread on navy cloth. The same flag Natalie had carried home in her hands after completing the 3-mile escort through the Hindu Kush, round still coming, and then the long flight back to an empty apartment where she'd never spoken his name aloud again. Colonel Chen, Chen's son, visited one Thursday afternoon. brought Emma, Natalie's daughter, now 14, tall and serious like her mother. Emma asked about the photograph. Colonel Chen signed to his father in flowing ASL, and his father's hands moved like he was telling a story from the beginning of time. Colonel Chen turned to Emma. That's the day your mom brought her friend home. She carried him 3 miles under fire so his family could say goodbye. Emma touched the frame, her fingers careful against the glass. She didn't cry. Hayes women didn't cry where anyone could see. Natalie's first major decision as Chief of Emergency Medicine was approving Master Sergeant Chen's proposal for a veteran trauma program. 2 former combat medics hired as nursing staff. A pipeline for transitioning military medical personnel. A way to bring home the ones who'd learned to save lives in places where saving lives mattered more than policy. The program launched in September. By November, they'd trained 32 new nurses and helped 8 veterans transition into emergency medicine careers. She stood in the ER at 0215, coffee cup in hand, stained, deliberately stained, watching her staff work a car accident victim with the efficiency she'd taught them. 14 minutes from EMS arrival to stabilization. The same speed as a combat medical evacuation. Her phone buzzed. Text from her son, deployed, 5A Scorpion, Kandahar Province. Chen says you're back. Proud of you, Mom. Stay visible. She smiled. Type back, leading from here. You keep coming home. She meant it as both fact and prayer. The final teaching moment came in early November. Natalie in the simulation lab, instructing 12 new residents on trauma response. A mannequin lay on the table, tension pneumothorax protocol. She demonstrated the needle decompression with hands that remembered the exact angle, the exact depth, the exact moment you'd feel the hiss of escaping air. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You'll know when you're right. The patient tells you are through their breath, through their oxygen saturation, through their will to live. A resident asked the question that always came, what if we get fired for it? Natalie set down the needle. Her voice dropped 2 octaves. Then you get fired by people who weren't there. People who've never heard the sound a human makes when they can't breathe. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The room was silent. The kind of silence that carries weight. On her office wall, behind her desk, Morrison's folded flag sat in a shadow box. Navy cloth, white embroidered name tape, the fold precise as a military funeral, because it was from a military funeral. The Navy cross sat beside it, not framed, just present. Her hands were steady now. The tremor that had lived in them since the Hindu Kush, the tremor that had shaken through her during grand rounds and at the vending machine and in the HR office, that tremor was gone. Replaced by something harder. Earned through fire. Earned through 30 years of saving lives in places where saving lives meant everything. Earned through being invisible until the moment visibility mattered. The camera pans across the hospital. Nurses moving between rooms. Residents taking notes. Chen in his office, photo on desk. Natalie teaching. The flag in the shadow box. The coffee stain framed on the wall. All of it real. All of it earned. All of it the price of being seen. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your history, if you've ever held quiet strength while someone mistook silence for weakness, this story was for you. Subscribe for more stories of the invisible heroes who walk among us, the ones who save lives without needing anyone to watch. Like this video. Comment below, who's the quiet hero in your workplace that everyone overlooks? And if you know someone who embodies invisible strength, share this with them. Because true heroism never stops, even when everyone stops watching.